been with us over the last several weeks, we've been in 1 Corinthians, and we'll go ahead and get into our teaching time now. And the theme, as you can see on the screen, overall, it deals with honor versus humility. And when it comes down to it, a lot of us, we would much prefer to be in a position where we're recognized and we're appreciated and we're honored, instead of one where we're humbled and we're serving and we're doing the dirty jobs and the difficult things in life. And Paul is one of the early church leaders in the first century. He's really trying to encourage this church that he had started a few years before he's writing this letter that we call 1 Corinthians in the New Testament of the Bible. He's really trying to challenge the people in this church to return to a posture of humility, because they've really been concerned with themselves, and that's something that their society drives them towards. If you want to get more details on why they are the way they are, we talked about that several weeks ago, and you can check out our YouTube channel and find those messages and those teaching series. But today we find ourselves in a place where we're going to recap last week, where Paul was introducing the importance of love, and we're also going to step into something else that's really important if a church is going to benefit a lot of people. And not just a select few. And so we're going to walk into that today. But here's a quick recap if you weren't with us last week. So followers of Jesus in the ancient city of Corinth, turn this on really quickly here. They had been gifted by God's Spirit to help the church community really reach its full potential. There are some people here who can... Oh, this is last week's. This is last week's. Sorry. This week's is there, but it's not that. I have notes, so we're not in a deal here, but I might have them switch and put a different PowerPoint up, because this is going to just give you a rehash of last week. I read one line and I was like, this doesn't match, so that's why. Anyway, just a brief pause. You can look at that pretty picture while I take you into this week's instead of exactly what you heard last Sunday. So there are believers, followers of Jesus in this ancient Greek city of Corinth, and they're very, very gifted. Some people can communicate in a variety of languages, or they exercise extreme faith. Other people are really capable teachers or counselors or encouragers or leaders or organizers. Other people are just very generous. They have resources to be generous with. They're creative. They're very skilled, maybe in certain professions or artistic talents. Or they're merciful. And they have all these things so that they can improve the quality of life for their church community and address practical needs. But their efforts are not making much of an impact, unfortunately. And that's because they are very critical or conceited when they teach or speak. Their leadership is all about competition and just asserting control over people. And they're serving, but just in ways that are convenient for them. They don't really see other people as precious. They're more concerned with their own status and their own comfort and their own well-being than really elevating other people or empowering other people in their church community. And they haven't yet learned humility or sacrifice or commitment or compassion, because, as we talked about last week, they're lacking the most essential thing from Paul's point of view, and that's love. And there are a lot of positive things that a church community can bring into your life, but if you walk in every week and nobody loves you, it's just, the relationships are not warm. People don't really care. They're in it for themselves. And you walk away thinking, that was great information, but no one cares. How much of an impact are all those gifted people going to have on one another? Not much at all, right? And that was Paul's point. And so, again, just to back up here, chapters 13 and 14, 13 was last week, 14 we're getting into this week in 1 Corinthians. They're all kind of linked, and they're revisiting this question, what does it mean to be a spiritually mature person? And so last week, I think Paul would say, part of spiritual maturity, it means loving everyone, because if that's not present, there's something that's just still kind of childish about the way that you're operating. So treating people as precious and making selfless and unconditional sacrifices to improve the well-being of other people is kind of the Bible's idea of what love is. I want to tell you a quick story. A couple nights ago, we read some bedtime stories to our kids, and one of my daughters came up to me and said, "Hey, Dad, how do you spell dumb?" When your kid asks you a question like that, that should put some red flags up immediately. Because she's our creative child and kind of devious child at times. Hey, Dad, how do you spell this? And so, of course, wanting to take that educational moment. I said D-U-M-B, that's how you spell dumb. Thanks, Dad. A few minutes later, my kids had Post-it notes, and they were writing really creative things on those and sticking them on my back. And one of them said, "My name is Jason McDowell," and this was Jason McDumdum. And they stuck it on my back, right? Which wasn't very loving. But the reason why they did that and they thought it was absolutely hilarious is because they're still immature. They're still kind of childish, right? They haven't yet grasped what love is and thought, well, how will Dad feel if I write that and stick it on his back, right? They're operating on kind of a lower level on that. They're just laughing and thinking it's fun for themselves, right? They're not concerned about me at all. And that was kind of the position of this church. They weren't really concerned with other people. They just were concerned with themselves and their own points of view. And in this chapter, we're going to learn that another aspect of spiritual maturity means using our God-given gifts to benefit Jesus' body, which in Christian terms is this community of believers that we would call church today, and that's what they called themselves back in the first century as well. So community of Jesus followers, by emphasizing clarity and eliminating chaos. And those are two things that we need to do to benefit each other. And this week, we'll just talk about the first one of those, how to emphasize clarity in different ways. We're going to walk into some things that might seem a little unfamiliar culturally to some of you, depending on your religious upbringing, or just the fact that we're 2,000 years removed from this point in history, and so we'll have to get a little bit of background for that as well. So there's a couple important Bible words and phrases that we're going to come across today. One of them, and we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, is prophecy. And we have all kinds of different preloaded ideas about what it means to be a prophet or to use prophecy, right, from our culture. But in the Bible, essentially, it's this God-given ability to, part of it's perceiving hidden realities, and it might be noticing things or picking up on things that other people don't realize. There is a part of it, especially in the Old Testament of the Bible, where a lot of these prophetic figures could see realities that existed in the spiritual realm or that God had planned that would happen, right, that normal people just couldn't recognize or didn't have information about. There's also an aspect of it that just involves communicating God's teaching to people. And then there's an aspect of it that involves offering challenging and encouraging and comforting messages that turn people's hearts back to God. And that's kind of a way to understand prophecies. There's a lot of different angles of it. It's not just this person that dresses crazy and does crazy things and goes out speaking about the future, doomsday kind of things all the time. It's much more palatable, I guess, in the Bible than that. And so don't take that assumption when we talk about this gift of prophecy. It's more someone who can do these types of things, not necessarily someone who's just predicting future events. Okay. Another word, tongue or tongues. In the New Testament, it means either the thing in your mouth, the organ that speaks, or it means languages. It's the way that they talked about languages in Greek in the first century. And in the Bible, it's specifically a God-given ability to speak or pray or sing or sometimes translate a variety of unfamiliar human. And then because of some things that the Apostle Paul says that are confusing, some Christian denominations think also possibly angelic or divine languages without prior training. And depending on your denominational upbringing or your interpretation of different things in the Bible, you might, again, just limit it to human languages, or you might allow some room and say maybe it's talking about angelic or divine languages as well. But the idea is that you can speak in or translate these languages without prior training. And we'll talk about why that might have been something that was happening in the first century, why it might have been super helpful, and also why it was a big distraction in this church in ancient Corinth in a few minutes. And so we're going to look at emphasizing clarity, because with these two gifts, prophecy as we defined it and tongues as we just talked about it, things were really confusing if you would have walked into a church service in ancient Corinth. And so Paul's addressing that and saying, how can we clear things up and bring about a better worship experience for everyone involved? And that's a great question for us too, because as we come into a church, we want to be clear in the ways that we serve. We want to clearly represent Jesus. If we're serving, we want to show what his example would be like so other people don't get the wrong ideas about Jesus. If we're teaching and we're speaking and we're summarizing Jesus' teachings or talking about Jesus' identity as God, we want to be clear. We don't want to be confusing. If we're talking about how to come back into a relationship with God, we want to be clear. We don't want to be confusing. And so clarity is something that's really important that we need to latch onto as a church community as well, if we're going to benefit each other and anyone who might walk into our community as well and try to discover more about Jesus, what it means to follow him. So that's going to be our focus today. And chapter 14 starts out with this verse. Paul says, pursue love, but also desire, or you could even use a stronger word, envy, spiritual gifts. Paul is just rephrasing 1 Corinthians 12:31, the end of chapter 12, because chapter 13 was a little parenthesis where he talked about the importance of love. And now he's kind of picking up the conversation about these spiritual or God-given gifts where he left off at the end of chapter 12 in this letter. And in that verse, he said, desire the greater gifts, but I'll show you a better way, and that was the way of love. So spiritually mature people, they love everyone, and they also desire to use their God-given gifts, but they don't want to just do it for themselves. They want to do it to pour out, to empty themselves in order to benefit other people. And so that's kind of a good way to summarize where we left off and where we're headed in the next few verses this morning. Again, this isn't the case in ancient Corinth. So individuals who have been gifted specifically with the ability to speak in or interpret unfamiliar languages, they're using that ability to draw everybody's attention in the church gathering to themselves, to make a spectacle. And it results in them being perceived as the more spiritual people, more spiritual than everyone else, because their gift, it seems more spectacular, more supernatural, right? You have suddenly this ability to speak in a language that you never took the time to learn. That is impressive, right? If I suddenly started speaking in Arabic this morning, all right, I have no prior training, that would be incredibly impressive. You might want to come to church next week to see what language I might start speaking in then, right? I mean, this is like, I'd invite people to come see that. But Paul's saying there's some issues with that, because then you start to view certain people as like super spiritual. And what is everyone else who doesn't have that gift? And can anyone in the audience understand the language that's being spoken? So these are the issues that start to come up. So he says, desire these spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. And again, prophecy in his frame of reference, it's not predicting future things. It's mainly understanding things that take insight. It's communicating messages that are encouraging and comforting and challenging. It's clearly presenting information about who God is. And so we have to take it in light of how he kind of defines it in these chapters. So desire those kinds of gifts. He says, for the person who speaks in a tongue, and I'm going to substitute the phrase unfamiliar language because that's how we should understand it in the context of this chapter, is not speaking to people, but to God, since no one understands him. And so apparently in this church, people are using this gift, but they're using languages that aren't familiar to people, and so like God understands, but no one else does. Paul says that person speaks mysteries in the Spirit. On the other hand, the person who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and consolation. So unfamiliar languages, they will remain a mystery. So Paul's saying if you want to emphasize clarity, you need to prioritize meaningful words in a church gathering. He's not necessarily talking about somebody's private relationship before God, but he's saying when you all are gathered together as a church, emphasize meaningful words that are going to give strength and comfort and encouragement to people who show up. He continues on in verse 4. He says, the person who speaks in an unfamiliar language builds himself up, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. So unfamiliar languages will really only elevate individuals. So if I'm speaking in some unfamiliar language to you, maybe I understand it, or maybe it just draws a lot of attention to me, and it builds me up. You think of me as more spiritual, but it doesn't do much for everyone as a community. We need meaningful words, according to Paul's logic, to elevate the entire community. So when we're all gathered together, let's focus on clear words and meaningful words. He says in verse 5, I wish all of you spoke in unfamiliar languages. That's interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. He says, but even more that you prophesied. So he's saying one of these is more beneficial. The person who prophesies is greater than the person who speaks in unfamiliar languages. Greater in the sense of, it seems like here, providing more of a benefit to people. unless he interprets so that the church may be built up. So yes, if you speak in an unfamiliar language and someone is interpreting what is being said, then that has the ability to build people up because it's made clear. Again, it's interpreted. I spent some time in Africa about, now it's probably been 15 years ago. And when I was doing that, we had opportunities to speak to some local people. And I do not speak Lugisu or other tribal dialects of eastern Uganda. But thankfully, some of the people we were with did. And so as I would speak, I would talk, and then I would wait a moment, and somebody would translate into that local language so that what I was speaking could be understood. And it's the same thing. You can communicate clearly. Now they even have, I guess, earbuds that will start to use Google Translate and other AI to translate on the fly. And this is exciting because I can picture a world in 10 or 15 years where if you just have these little earbuds, everybody has one, you can speak whatever language you want. It's all clear and understandable. And that, I think, is what Paul's going for in a church service. Like, if it's clear, then that's going to be beneficial. So he says, now, brothers and sisters, if I come to you speaking in an unfamiliar language, how will you benefit unless I speak to you with the revelation or knowledge? Or how will I benefit you unless I speak to you with the revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? So he's saying prophets, these people that are speaking clear words to build up other people in a church community, they're providing insight and wisdom and calls to action and information, and that's going to cause growth. But if you're speaking in an unfamiliar language, unless it's interpreted, it's not really helping everyone. Again, it's not clear, so it's not beneficial. And so let's come back to this question. This is interesting. Why do you think Paul says he wishes everybody spoke in unfamiliar languages? If he seems to be presenting all the cons to that, why do you think he might think that way? Why would he say something like that? Any of you have any thoughts? Sometimes I do like open comments here, so if you have any thoughts and you want to express them, feel free.
Because it's direct conversation with God that can't be interpreted by other people or the adversary.
Okay, so like there's different perspectives, but one perspective might be that it does involve some kind of a direct conversation with God. And maybe the person speaking has an understanding of what they're saying. Maybe other people around don't, maybe they do, or maybe God understands. There's actually different denominations of Christianity emphasize tongues, for example, as a prayer language. And I had friends when I was in my college years that emphasized that. And they would use it, they would speak words that they themselves were not familiar with. And for them, that was a way of them expressing to God, maybe they had feelings or concerns or weight on them that like they just couldn't put into words. And so they would use that as a way of expressing things to God that they really had no words for, right? I have not had that personal experience, but I know people who have. And so that was one way that they used it. Did you have a comment as well over here? Why would Paul have said this?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment. I mentioned it to you last week. It's kind of the same as when we're speaking now. If we have someone up there interpreting for people who are deaf.
Okay, sure, yeah.
That would
Right.
be them interpreting what you're saying, or vice versa.
Sure.
If we're watching somebody speak by sign, you would have to translate for them who understood their sign.
Sure. So another possibility that this opens up is that somebody could be in a community who spoke a different language, because you've got to remember in the ancient Roman world, you have people coming from all over, and common Greek is the trade language, but you have people from all different dialects and regions showing up in these port cities. And Corinth was right in the middle of two very important ports if you're going from Rome to the east across the Roman Empire. So there's a lot of traffic, a lot of trades moving through there. And so that would open up some possibilities. Did you have a comment as well?
So if we're dealing with multiple languages, all language is inherently some signs which are incomplete.
Okay.
So if we have somebody that's capable of speaking multiple languages, they can capture different concepts, ideas, thoughts that may not be available in this case, the native Greek or whatever.
Sure.
Regional language that they're addressing.
Right, that's a great comment. So every language is limited, in other words, and we don't have adequate words in English to describe certain concepts. Like you'll hear things, I've heard some Japanese words recently, and I can't remember them exactly, but they were for concepts like essentially ways that you should live, more efficiently or things like that. And I was like, that's a great idea. And for us, it would take a whole sentence or a paragraph to explain that concept, but for them, there's one word. But that's simply not present in the English language. And so having the ability to utilize multiple languages could fill in the gaps of trying to understand a God who's beyond comprehension, right? And so that would be beneficial. Somebody else have a comment? Yeah.
It also shows the
Sure. Shows a large area where God's word is being understood. In fact, the way that we first encounter this gift is when the Holy Spirit is given to about 120 of Jesus' followers. It's early in the book of Acts. It's in chapter 2 if you want to read the history of that. But they go out, and there are a lot of Jewish people from all regions of the Roman Empire, from northern Africa, from east toward India, from up toward Turkey, from Greece, from all over. And these people have all gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate one of the Jewish feasts of Pentecost, but they all speak different languages. And so the way that this gift starts is when the Holy Spirit comes into these followers of Jesus, they start talking in these different dialects and different languages, and everyone who's come into the region can hear about Jesus in their own language. And so it facilitates the message of Jesus spreading out into all these cultures without the few people who know him, who are all Jewish and mostly from Galilee and not trained in linguistics, having to take years to study these different languages and go out like maybe missionaries would today. And so there are benefits to this. And so Paul is not saying this gift doesn't have a purpose, but he's saying in the church service, the way that this community of believers in Corinth is using that gift, that's not the way that really it was intended to be used. There's other profitable ways to use it. But it causes a lot of confusion in that group church service, especially when everyone who has it is all using it at once, right? And that's what Paul paints a picture of later in this chapter. So verse 7, he says, even lifeless instruments that produce sounds, whether flutes or harps, so think musical instruments, think our worship team here this morning, if they don't make a distinction in the notes, how will what's played be recognized? In fact, if the trumpet makes an unclear sound, who will prepare for battle? So they use instruments for music, they use instruments in warfare back then. But the idea is if you can't tell what notes are being played, it's just a sound, it's kind of confusing. In the same way, he says, unless you use your tongue, and I think in this one time he's talking about this, the organ in your mouth, right? For intelligible speech, how will what's spoken be known? For you'll be speaking into the air. So unfamiliar language, it draws attention, but it doesn't enable songs to be understood or people to be prepared to take actions like they would in battle. You can't be prepared to do things in a local church. It's not helping everyone. Verse 10, he says, there are doubtless many different kinds of languages in the world. None is without meaning. So language has meaning. That's why we use it, right? Therefore, if I do not know the meaning of the language, I'll be a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker will be a foreigner to me. So again, if I don't understand, it's totally foreign. I've been in places before where people spoke many, many languages. I think of a time when I was in line at Disney World. My uncle used to live in Orlando, Florida, and so we would take family trips there growing up. And there are people from all over the world that converge on Disney World. In fact, Zion Park is very much the same way. I've been on shuttle buses seated next to people speaking French, people speaking German, people speaking Italian, people speaking Portuguese, and I don't know what they're saying, right? And that's the same kind of effect that many languages at once that people don't have any knowledge of could have an effect of. He says, so also you, since you're zealous for spiritual gifts, they seek to excel in building up the church. And so that's the purpose of these gifts. He says, therefore, the person who speaks in an unfamiliar language should pray that he can interpret. For if I pray in an unfamiliar language, my spirit prays, but my understanding is unfruitful. And so he's making the assumption that they're praying in these languages. And so maybe it is something that involves communication with God. Maybe it is a divine or angelic language. We don't know for certain because Scripture just simply doesn't say in that area. We don't know all the details. We can't fully define this gift accurately. But let's say that was happening. He says, my understanding is unfruitful. My spirit prays. But they were doing it, again, in the church gathering. Not personally, but with everyone. And so no one knows what this individual is praying. He says, what then? Will I pray with the Spirit? And I will also pray with my understanding. I will sing praise with my spirit, and I will also sing praise with my understanding. So he's saying, when we're meeting as a church, I want my spirit to be able to pray and interact with God and sing and interact with God, and that's what we do in worship. Our spirit, that part of us within us, right? We're interacting with a reality of God and the truths that are conveyed in that music, right? But we want to know what we're singing. We want to know what we're praying, especially in a group gathering. He says, otherwise, if you praise with the Spirit, how will the outsider say amen at your giving of thanks since he doesn't know what you're saying? So somebody comes in and they're not a part of the church family or they're not gifted in the way that you are and they're just checking things out. How are they going to know what's being conveyed through the singing or through the prayer? He says, I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. In other words, there is a purpose for these unfamiliar languages, again, Paul's saying. Yet in the church, I would rather speak 5 words with my understanding in order to teach others also than 10,000 words in a tongue or an unfamiliar language. And so again, Paul's just addressing this practical need at this point in time. And we can learn from it, and it emphasizes the importance of clarity. So praying or singing in unfamiliar languages in a church gathering, it really caused division because some people were lifted up, other people were seen as not quite as spectacular or gifted, and it caused confusion, especially to people who couldn't understand or people coming in to check and see what church was about from the outside, unless there was interpretation. But spiritual gifts are all about improving the church. And that's what we should really keep at the forefront of our mind is, how am I gifted, and how can I use that gift to improve this or whatever your local church community that you happen to be a part of is? So we're going to finish in the next few minutes with some what can be very confusing words, verses 20 through 25 in this chapter. And I want to give you my take on it. There are a lot of different people that have different takes and different interpretations. The one I'm going to give you is the one that makes most sense to me, and it's the one that I think logically follows what Paul is saying. But that having been said, you're more than welcome to completely disagree with everything I say over the next 5 minutes. Okay? So let's go on a little journey here. They're going to get a little complicated, and they're challenging to translate to, because if you look at these texts that are written in the first few centuries, these texts of the Bible that are written in ancient Greek, there are no punctuation marks. There aren't any periods in sentences even. Everything is like one run-on sentence where you have a tablet and it's just letter, 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 and you have to be able to know where the words stop and start because you know what the words are. There's no quotation marks, no exclamation points, no nothing, okay? And so that makes it challenging to translate. So in verse 20, Paul says this. He says, brothers and sisters, don't be childish in your thinking, which he seems to be kind of setting out on a little, like a new comment here, because he hasn't really been, I guess in a way he's been addressing childishness in the sense that, they're lifting themselves up, but it seems like he's kind of segueing here into a little bit of a different conversation. Don't be childish in your thinking, but be infants in regard to evil and adults in your thinking. So he's saying, think like mature Christians, spiritually mature people here. And what I think he's going to say next, I would put in brackets here, you are saying, because I think what he's doing is verses 21 and 22, which we're about to read, I think they should be put in quotations based on the flow of Paul's logic. Because if you don't see these next 2 verses as something where he's referring back to something that the Corinthians have said to him in the past or maybe written to him about in the past, we know there's letters going back and forth between Paul and the Corinthians dealing with these church issues. And if you don't see these next 2 verses as Paul referencing something that the Corinthians are thinking, something incorrect, then what you're going to find in the 2 verses after that, verses 23 and 24, is that Paul's going to be contradicting himself. He's going to seem to say one thing in verses 21 and 22, and then he's going to tell you the exact opposite thing in verses 23 and 24. And that doesn't jive with who I know the Apostle Paul to be. He seems like he's very well thought out, very well spoken, and for him to say one thing and 2 verses later to say the exact opposite thing just doesn't make sense to me. And so I think these next 2 verses are Paul quoting what the Corinthians actually think that's an incorrect way to think about this gift of unfamiliar languages. So that's my opinion. Can't prove it, but I'm going to come from that point of view. So here's verses 21 and 22. It's written in the law. And again, I don't think Paul is saying this. I think the Corinthians have this justification for why they think it's okay to speak in unfamiliar languages in the church service, even though it's kind of chaotic. It's written in the law. I will speak to this people by people of other tongues and by the lips of foreigners, and even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord. Speaking in tongues, then, is intended as a sign, not for believers, but for unbelievers, while prophecy is not for unbelievers, but for believers. So let me unpack what I think this means. I think the Corinthians seem to have believed that the purpose of these unfamiliar languages was to, he quotes a verse in Isaiah, and I don't know whether or not I should take time to go there. I'm trying to be respectful of your time. Maybe I'll take a whirlwind tour through it in just a second. Just just glide through it. But there's a quote in Isaiah and where it says, I will speak to this people by people of other tongues, languages, and by the lips of foreigners, and even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord. There's only a couple problems. One is that's not exactly what the verse says in the Hebrew version of the Bible or in the Greek version of the Old Testament of the Bible. And so that verse has been adapted. It's been tweaked, summarized, just a little bit. And I think by the Corinthians to justify, again, using these unfamiliar languages in the church service. And the context of it is, in ancient Israel, the priests and the teachers, the religious teachers, were getting drunk all the time. And so when they were teaching, their messages sounded kind of like a drunken baby babble. And so God was using Isaiah to talk to the leaders at that point in time and saying, as a form of judgment, what you will experience, like you're kind of babbling to the people now because you're far away from me and you could care less about me, and you're the religious leaders. And so eventually Israel is going to be captured by the Babylonian Empire. People are going to be deported, taken captive, marched over to Babylon. And in that language, you're really going to hear people babbling. You're going to hear people speaking foreign languages to you because you're not in my land. You're not in this place that I set aside for you because you've been disobedient. And when you hear that foreign language, it's going to be like a sign of God's judgment against you for the way that you've been treating me and for your distance from me. So what I think is that the Corinthians were referring to that and saying, look, that's what the gift of tongues is today. The gift of unfamiliar languages is supposed to be today in the church. It's supposed to be for people who do not believe God. And it's a sign of God's judgment against them because they don't understand anything. They don't want to listen. And so now when they come in, they won't be able to listen. They won't be able to understand because they just have a hard heart. They don't want to listen. I think that's how the Corinthians were using this. I'm not going to go into the detail of these next two slides because that gets into a little bit of technicality. But I think that logic, that this gift of tongues is just to further isolate people from God who don't want to hear about God anyway. When they walk into a church, they're like, well, I can't understand this anyway. I think the Corinthians would say, well, that's because you're not spiritual people. That's because you're far away from God. And so as a judgment, he's going to have you listen to our words that are unfamiliar, and you're just going to be pushed further and further away from God until eventually one day you wake up and think, I need God, right? But I think that logic seemed childish to Paul because that's not how the rest of the Corinthians came to Jesus. They came to Jesus by hearing Paul speak very meaningful words, clear messages about Jesus, simple messages. And that's what he's going to do at the beginning of chapter 15. In a few more verses, he's going to say, here's the simple message that I did share with you, right? Here's the gospel. Christ died for our sins, according to the scriptures. I didn't speak in unfamiliar languages to show you how far you were from God. I gave you the truth you needed to know to come back to him. So I think that's what these verses are about. Verse 23, and I think this is Paul shifting back to himself again. I think he's making a conclusion. He's disagreeing with them. He says, if therefore the whole church assembles together and all are speaking in tongues or unfamiliar languages, and people who are outsiders or unbelievers come in, will they not say that you're out of your minds? Right? They don't understand anything. They're not going to think, well, I'm far from God. They're going to think, you people are crazy. But if all are prophesying, so speaking clearly, and some unbelievers or outsiders come in, it says that person is convicted by all and is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart will be revealed, and as a result, he will fall face down and worship God, proclaiming God is really among you. So I think Paul believed that clear communication, not a spectacle that would seem insane to outsiders, would be the thing that's going to reveal God's wisdom and presence when they come into a church gathering. So they would have said, this gift of unfamiliar languages, it's for an unbeliever to walk in and say, I'm hard-hearted and now I'm further from God. And prophecy, that's for clear messages, or for the people who are really spiritually in tune. And Paul says it's kind of opposite, right? There has to be a level of spiritual maturity already for this gift of unfamiliar languages to work right. And with people who are outside the church community or unbelievers, you need it to be as clear as possible. And so that's how I think Paul is guiding them as a church. So after part of a chapter like this, the question is, well, what do we take from this and how can we use it here in 2021? 2021, gosh, 2025. Sorry, lost something there. 2025, I don't know. So here's the basic question. How can I use my God-given gifts to clarify Jesus' identity, teachings, and way of life? I think it's all about clarity for us, right? How many of you, I want you to raise your hand on this, if you will. If not, that's okay. I don't want you to be uncomfortable. But how many of you would say, I think God has gifted me in an area that involves speaking? Not necessarily public speaking. Maybe it's just giving words of advice or counsel one-on-one. Maybe it's in singing, in the worship category, or explaining things, or teaching, or counseling, or, again, encouraging. Maybe it is a public role. How many think speaking might be my area of giftedness? Okay, you can put your hands down. If that's you, if my gift involves speaking, here's a question. Am I representing God and Jesus accurately? And am I speaking with humility on a level that matches my audience? Okay? Because we want to correctly represent Jesus as we speak. Or am I showing off my intelligence by focusing on information that's irrelevant or confusing to a new believer or a child? Because I'm on this higher plane, and I just want people to know I'm on a higher plane. So everything I shoot out at people is so high, you're on your tiptoes to try to even touch the bottom of what I'm saying. Am I offering wisdom or correction from a place of pride and blindness to my own flaws? So maybe I've got great advice, but I think I've got it all together. Am I sharing gossip instead of encouragement? So my gift is encouragement, but am I using it as a way to gossip? Or am I interrupting conversations just to hear me talk? Right? I've got so many great things to say, I just can't shut up and let anyone else say anything. I just have to give it all the time. Am I explaining the songs I'm singing or assuming everybody else is equally familiar with Bible words and theological debates and the history of American Christianity? Because a lot of songs import all those things into them, and it's not as simple as it sounds. How many of you would say, I think I have a gift in leadership? Let me define that. So maybe it's organization or administration or casting a vision or creativity or, again, just pointing people in the right direction. And some of the speaking gifts, might be involved in that sense as well. But would anybody here say, I think my gifts are in the area of leadership, administration, organization? That's me. Okay. If it is, am I following Jesus' example of servant leadership? Am I focused on shepherding people, not just making decisions, right? Or am I so far ahead, and this would be for the visionary person, that I'm out of touch with the present reality, right? I'm 10 years ahead, but we're not 10 years ahead. Am I collaborating or planning other people's lives? So I had somebody that used to say, I have a wonderful plan for your life. That's not the kind of leadership that we need, right? We need people to talk with people and figure out what their strengths are or how they want to serve and, work together, not just dictate, right? Am I grasping for power and control or micromanaging out of fear? Is that what I think leadership is? Am I empowering others or am I just using others to, again, meet my goals, achieve my goals? Is my hyperfixation with organization limiting my own effectiveness and that of other people around me? Has my abundant faith made me insensitive to the feelings and suffering of others? Because I just think, well, that's clear. You just trust the Lord, right? But that's not a lot of people's reality. People are struggling, right? You have to be empathetic. How many of you think your gift might involve serving in different ways? This could be generosity. It could be giving resources. It could be doing tasks for people. It could be using your trade skills for people, that kind of thing. It could be mercy. If my gift involves serving, am I driven by compassion and generosity and a desire to elevate other people and eliminate injustices and create an environment where everybody and everything can thrive? Is that why I'm serving? Or am I giving to get recognition or to put somebody else in my debt? If I give to them, I'm going to call in a favor. They're going to owe me. Or am I offering my skills in hopes of receiving compensation or so things will get done my way? Right? Sometimes skilled people, they know how things should be done, right? Or sometimes maybe there's a temptation to do it just so people will say, oh, well, I'll give you something for that. Am I choosing products or using methods that will harm the environment? Because there is a sense in which God did place us here on this planet to take care of the creatures and the world around us, not just each other. Am I showing mercy in ways that enable other people to have destructive habits, or in ways that enable abusive tendencies to be perpetuated, or codependency? Because I'm merciful, but is that helpful, right? So these are all things to consider as we use our gifts and we're thinking about, what is clarity, what is beneficial in different ways. So am I using my God-given gifts is question one, because sometimes we are gifted, but we're just not doing anything with those gifts. And then secondly, am I using my God-given gifts in ways that will enable other people to see Jesus more clearly, whether it's by word or by example, by action, and also know that they're loved.